Hi, my name is Mallory Whitfield, and today I'm going to be speaking with my friend Jessica Reis. Jessica is a death doula, which means she helps people to cope with death. She guides people and their loved ones through the process of dying and grief and dealing with loss, even if it's the loss of a pet. So let's dive right in. Hi, Jessica. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Mallory. This is awesome. I'm excited.
So you work as a death doula, a death empath. Can you explain what that means? Because I think that's the newer phrase, right? Newer terminology around that.
Yeah, so death doula, I'll start with that. And absolutely, these are new terms, new vocabulary, and one of my jobs is really to get people to understand what that is. So a death doula, it's if you're familiar with like a birthing doula, it's the same thing. We are guides for death transition. So we sit with people who are actively passing. We help facilitate end of life wishes like legacy work, medical advance directives, and also all things kind of end of life, from helping with grief support, helping understand kind of boundaries of the person's actively passing. But yeah, just pretty much we are death guides to simplify. And the death empath side is that I'm a death doula and I'm also an empath. So I just decided to combine those two things. And being an intuitive, being sensitive to emotions, energetic shifts in a room, really helped me support the person that I'm actively there to help, and also the loved ones, family, friends. So I allow my empathic abilities to create a really supportive, nurturing space for people.
Nice. I think that's really important and powerful to have somebody there. Um, and so I know you work like one-on-one with people, and then you do workshops for people who are dealing with death, learning how to cope with death and grief. So for somebody who's going through that, what are some like kind of beginner basic things that you would tell them to help them deal with coping with the loss of somebody?
Um, I'm a big proponent of like feeling all your feels. And a lot of the time when it comes to like death and grieving, we hold back. And we hold back either we don't want to be embarrassed, or we don't want to inconvenience others. And then there's also the I don't want other people to feel bad. And so I'm like, feel it all. Whatever comes out, whatever comes through. A lot of the stuff that I do very on the basic level is let's get you to access all the emotions and all the feelings so that they come out however they need to. You're yelling, throwing things, crying, doing nothing, running, locking yourself in a bedroom, whatever it may be, whatever it looks like. I like to give permission to do that first, because our emotions really are there to help guide us. And like when you have like a good cry and you feel better afterwards, it's the same thing. Like all these emotions, purging them really helps to start processing.
Yeah. Yeah. I know like I often struggled for a long time about not wanting to like lean into my feelings, wanting to hold back. And I think that's definitely something that many of us like culturally have been sort of taught to like not be vulnerable, not lean into our feelings.
Yeah, and I almost feel like maybe at some point we thought, or maybe people have used our feelings against us, like the vulnerability of our feelings. But I think, I don't know if you're feeling the same way. I'm starting to like sense the shift where people are a little more like open, understanding. I'm a huge like, let's hold space for other people, non-judgment, no criticism, especially in grief and our sadness when we're experiencing a loss. I think that should be kind of like a free for all. Like, okay, go feel whatever you need to feel. You just went through something incredibly devastating and life changing.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely sensing that shift, at least in my community.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's true. I think we're recording in August 2020, right? And so we're like 4 or 5 months into this whole COVID-19 like pandemic. And
Mhm.
I know people have been talking more openly about the grief around that. Like, obviously, there are people dying because of this and sick because of this, but there's all these other types of grief too, right? Where the grief of things that we thought would come to be, the grief of an old lifestyle that, like, who knows what things will look like on the other side of this.
Yeah. And I think that's Really, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's so important for us to also acknowledge our losses, no matter how big or small we think they are. They're still losses, and these are what I call living deaths or energetic deaths. It's, you know, you can mourn the loss of not being able to take that dream vacation you always wanted to Switzerland. Like you get to, you get to like mourn and grieve those things. They're, especially in my work, like there's no, you do or you don't get to, you just get to, like even simple things like you mentioned, like things that you thought were going to come to be. Some of us have been working really hard to start businesses or to get things off the ground or to transition into a different type of work, and that's a huge loss. So yeah, I feel like we definitely need to have that space to be able to just feel it all and lean in, like you said, and just be okay with the mourning of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned like grief, both sort of large and small. And I know one aspect that you work with people too is dealing with the loss of pets, right? Like I know we've talked about this, you and I, like the loss of a dog or a cat or any other type of pet. How is dealing with that type of death different, if it is at all, than dealing with like the loss of like a person in your life?
I see more people holding back when it comes to pets. And then that's why I love giving permission in that space, because for a lot of us, our pets are a part of our family. They are a part of our routine. They are a part of our everyday. We come home to them, and there's an energy to them. And when that part of your life is missing, and for me, like animals are very sacred and I'm very connected to them. So the loss of one is like, there's like a piece of my life missing. And so first for that, I love giving permission for them to fully express again, like they would a person, because to them, it's like equivalent energetically. Energetically, their pet is an equivalent to another human being. And so there's a lot of the allowing them to give them like a rite of passage for end of life, like putting ceremony to it, just like you would a person, the burial, the memorial. I have them eulogize. I'm like, yeah, definitely do a eulogy for them. Talk about all the beautiful things they brought to your life and how many times they made you laugh and how much you're going to miss them. But yeah, that part of my work, I actually really, really love. I mean, I love all of it, but there's, like I said, I'm so connected to animals and the sacredness and the bond that we have with them. I'm always like, man, these little furry, cute things like have accepted us. I don't see it the other way around. I see like these things were once wild out in the like wherever they were, and they're now a part of our lives, like inside, and bringing so much like light and happiness. So yeah, that's one of the things I really enjoy about being a death doula.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and death tends to have this like ripple effect, right? Like even if we're not directly connected to the person or the animal or, whoever it is that passes, we still can be affected by that. So like if somebody has somebody else in their life who's dealing with death and the loss of a loved one, what advice would you give to them in order to help cope? Because I know that's one of those situations where sometimes people feel like they don't want to say the wrong thing, or maybe, they accidentally say the wrong thing meaning well, but it can create more harm. So like, what advice would you have for people who have other people in their life who are dealing with death to help them?
So the first thing that generally tends to happen with when we have these like once removed kind of death situations, like it's not necessarily in your immediate circle, but it's someone who you love who's experiencing the death. It tends to give us a perspective, like a shift in how we see our own lives. So we tend to feel like grateful and guilty at the same time. Like I'm grateful I'm not experiencing that, but I'm also really guilty because this person passed away and the person that I love is hurting because of it. And I always tell people to kind of like sit with what like is coming up instead of like trying to find the right thing to say. Just sit with what you're feeling. Like if you feel awkward or uncomfortable or like scared or like really bad, you can say that to them. And like, I don't even know what to say to you. This seems like such a tragic incident. I'm with you. My heart is with you. Like be honest, be very forward with how you're really feeling, because that's genuine and authentic versus you kind of like most of us shy away from death in general. So we'll say something like, I'm so sorry for your loss, my condolences. And we'll leave like a little heart or a little broken heart or like a crying face emoji. And when someone is grieving, and I've heard this quite a bit, is they're reading through everything and everything just kind of looks the same. And so they just kind of get desensitized to the well wishes. And then every once in a while they'll read something like everything happens for a reason, and that tends to throw people into a spiral. Like most people who are grieving do get triggered by those well-meaning things. And again, we think by saying that what we're really trying to do is we're trying to save them from their pain. We're thinking like by saying these things, we're solutionizing. And that's not the point. The point of being there for anyone who's grieving is just holding space for them to feel whatever it is that they need to feel, and just letting them know that you're there. Sometimes you don't even have to say anything. Just you showing up and just like holding them, embracing them is enough.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And so death is like a natural part of life, right? We all know that, but I think some of us are more open to accepting that. But then a lot of people have a lot of fear around their own death, right? Their own mortality. I was listening to an audiobook recently by Pema Chodron, the Buddhist nun, and she was discussing the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and kind of, I'm sure you're probably familiar, kind of how do you approach, helping people, kind of what the work that you do. For people that are deathly afraid, not to use the pun, but like deathly afraid of their own death and mortality, what advice would you give to them to sort of embrace that fact of life?
There's a couple of things that happen with death that make it seem very scary. We're just not familiar with it. We've been kind of protected from it, kind of like when you're a little kid, we're not around it enough. So we tend to fear things we really don't fully understand. That's just kind of our natural go-to. But like how you're reading books on, the Book of the Dead and the Dying from, Tibetan monks. So it's really about kind of more educating yourself of end of life. And that's what doulas are trying to do. We're trying to make it a space that's more accessible. And so you realize that end of life, there's a gift in it. There's a gift of knowing. There's a gift of, I mentioned a rite of passage earlier, where it's, you go through this whole life cycle, but we're so accustomed to not having like the same sacredness or ceremony in end of life. Your end of life is that moment where your loved ones get to come together and support and hold you through your transition. And like, imagine being a parent and you see your child being at your bedside, walking you to the veil, pretty much. And you as a parent are like, okay, I'm good to let go, because look at my adult is like this fully formed human being that's able to sit with me in my dying and sit with me in my death. So there's the obvious, like the closer you are to death, the more you understand it, the research, like read books, articles, get an end of life doula, death doula for your, someone that you love that's actually passing. But I like to go a little bit further. A lot of people that I've encountered who have this like fear of death tend to have not yet actualized their dreams, right? So they tend to not like actualize their purpose or their calling, and they're kind of just living in this like floating in between space of just doing things every day, 9 to 5, the routine of it all. But there's this like gnawing in their spirit. And that's usually where like this fear of death, I can't die yet. I haven't done all the things I want to do. I haven't traveled. I haven't seen the world. I haven't found the love of my life. And so that's really where people get caught up. In my experience with people who've come to me with this fear of death, it's typically they're not pursuing what really makes them happy and whole.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially like if you listen to any of those, things that people on their deathbed have regretted, it's that sort of stuff, right? Not pursuing your dreams, not living fully.
Yeah, listening to others, working too hard, working too much. Yeah.
How did you get interested in this work?
So I've always been I was a weird kid, but I was always really fascinated by things when they were no longer animated. So kind of like the anatomy of things when they were dead. Kind of like, whoa, at one point it had life and now it's just this like vessel. And so it started with that kind of intrigue, but I was also, I battled with depression from like 13 till about maybe just 3 years ago. And I was always fascinated with death and dying. And I romanticized like dying one day and what that would look like. And I can finally leave this place, this whole like, when do I get to leave this place? This is ridiculous. And I kind of put all that like death stuff, I tried to stifle it and push it aside all the time because people said I was weird and like, who does that? And, and so I went through my life and I was able to manage my high functioning depression. I learned to like through therapy to really manage it. And then I did the normal route. I started my own business and I did that whole thing, but I wasn't actually like happy and whole. I was content and managing my depression. And, I started getting this like calling to get back into death work, or at least like reading up on it, educating myself on it. And then my husband's grandmother passes away. And culturally, my family, we like, as soon as we hear someone's like injured in the hospital, we all get up and we just go. It's almost like we believe our energetic presence helps heal them. And I'm grabbing all my things, and my mother and father-in-law are kind of not really they're just going around doing their thing. And it's Mother's Day, so it's like an extra. And I asked my husband, what's going on? Are we not going to go say goodbye to grandma? And he's like, well, my parents said they already said goodbye. So, and I like, it didn't register. I was like, wait, what does that matter? Let's go. Like, she's passing. And that was like kind of my first, recognition, real like acknowledgement, and how like some people just don't want to be in that space because they're either afraid of it, they're not accustomed to it. They were raised where like, no, we say our goodbyes and they kind of pass away on their own. And that was so disturbing to me. I didn't know, I wasn't trying to judge it, but I was like so moved, not in a good way, by it, that I was like, this doesn't feel right. So I started looking up, like, how do you volunteer for people who are dying alone? How do you volunteer for hospice? And then this group called the NELDA popped up, the International End of Life Doula Association. And I started reading up all their resources, and I just resonated with it so deeply that I looked up like, okay, when's their next training? And it's like in 2 weeks, but it's in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm in California. Like, I'm like, well, I've never been to Wisconsin, so might as well see how much flights are. And so I jumped on in 2 weeks on a flight, and I was in training for it. And it was life-changing because you become very intimate with end-of-life practices, like the what you see, the physical aspects of the body that change, and also the spiritual side of it. And they make you write your own like last words and your vigil. And I, again, since I'd suffered with depression for so long, I was like, what does my death look like then? And I realized it had changed. I remember just crying and crying and crying and going like, whoa, this is really impactful. And this is cathartic. And I'm now having this permission to go into this work that I wanted to do since I was little, pretty much, right? Like, I was fascinated with death even then. 3 months later, my grandmother passes away. And I'm at her deathbed, and I was her guide. I was my grandmother's death guide. And she passed away in my arms, like took her last breath. I was holding her. And in that moment, I realized how powerful and how much of a gift being in someone's transition really, really is. And I was a different person. I came out of that, like, for 2 weeks, I was like in this weird, like, whoa, like spiral. But then afterwards, I was like, this is incredible. My grandma gave me a gift. I'm like, can show up as this like death person and all of it, and really help people through this transition. So I almost feel like she guided me to it. She's probably calling out to me for me to do this work. Because then I also realized later, this was 4 years ago, that this is something that's in my culture. Like, we have they're not called death doulas, but there's always like a family member that comes and does all the vigil and the praying and like the candle lighting. And so it's like a part of my bloodline anyway. And so it's almost like I'm just kind of like I excavated it. And now I'm like the baton's been passed to me and like, okay, now you get to do this work and you get to like share with everybody. But that's really what it comes down to. It's like death work saved my life because I haven't been depressed since that day. Like, honestly, I have not had like it's not chronic. I may have some like sad days, but I do not feel the heaviness and the weight of the depression I did for like 20 plus years.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that you touched on kind of something that I was wondering about that I was going to ask you, the cultural aspect, because I know you're Mexican American and I know that there's like the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, right? Like that is a thing that I think most Americans kind of are aware of now, but I didn't know like how much deeper that sort of cultural aspect of like death goes.
Yeah. I mean, we have a saint called Santa Muerte, which is the Saint Death. And man, thank you, Coco, for making the Day of the Dead such a big thing. And so different parts of Mexico celebrate death differently. So the Day of the Dead wasn't something I really grew up with, but it's something that I fully embrace now. But what we were allowed is children were allowed to be at the viewings. We were allowed to hold our loved ones while they were in their coffins. And we saw our family members crying and like outpouring, like jumping on coffins, like being completely distraught. So I saw grief and death fully expressed growing up. When I did my training with Inelda, I was like the only one with that story of like being allowed, not being shielded from death. And I didn't know that. So I'm in this room with like 40 other people, and I'm the only one that has that story of being able to, being a 7-year-old kid and being invited to like touch their grandpa who just died, and having his body for 2-3 days as a viewing, and we're praying. And I remember the room being dark and candles everywhere. Everyone's holding candles and praying, and you just hear all these, there's like 40-50 people in this one little tiny like apartment house thing, and you just hear all these prayers, and it felt so sacred. But it also felt so warm and comforting. It had this feeling of community and love. And so culturally, I mean, and that's what I love about different cultures express death differently. But as Western culture, we've really hidden from it, where if you just go back maybe 100 years, Edwardian times, we had full embrace of, we did death photos. We would like make rings with teeth and like hair lockets, and we have bracelets with people's hair, and we embraced it differently. We realized it was a part of life, and we wanted to also celebrate the people we loved. We used to dress in black for a whole like year of mourning, so it was interesting how we shifted out of that.
Yeah. I used to work at the Louisiana State Museum here in New Orleans, and we had a lot of the hair jewelry from Victorian times, which is like fascinating to me. And I know a lot of people are kind of grossed out by it because it's literally like jewelry and brooches and stuff made out of human hair. But I think it's really cool.
I think it's super cool. Like the teeth rings are the best. I'm like, it's like literally someone's like molar, like on a ring, and you're like, okay. And now we're doing stuff like that with ashes. So now we're doing rings where they're embedding ashes into like the stone. They're doing actual like rocks and crystals where they're putting ashes into it. So it's kind of like bringing that back without, I guess, being as gross. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think it's cool too how you're talking about like your own experience as a child of sort of having death be more like normalized, I guess, right? Whereas I mean, I lost all 4 of my grandparents by the time I was like in high school. They had passed away when I was fairly young. And I remember going, I think, to all or most of the funerals. But then I know other people, like my ex-partner, his mom died when he was really young, and he didn't go to the funeral. And I think he kind of lacked some closure that sort of came up later in life. And I don't know, like, do you ever advise like people who have young kids on like, how to help the little ones deal with death?
Kids are actually naturally pretty good about it. They kind of just understand it in a different way. They're a little more like open to it. It does take about 6 months for kids to fully like process, and you'll start seeing them grieve like months later. you'll see them like curled up in a ball, just crying, depending on the closeness or how they felt about the person that passed. It's like a sibling, you usually see like someone, a child just on the floor crying, holding a picture of their like lost brother. But kids are pretty good about it. You know, they bring their own like spin and flavor to their experience, which is so, because there's so much, there's rawness to it. So like, you know, like any little kid, when they start talking to you about things that they love or something that's really meaningful to them, the way they're able to communicate it is like, wow, you really love what you're talking about. And they do that with death. I've heard some kids, 5-6-year-old kids say some profound, profound things when I'm holding, you know, when we're doing memorials for their lost cat, like a cat they really lost. Or I remember this kid, he lost his grandmother, and he was like holding her hand, and she's like in her coffin, and he's just like, grandmother, he's like, what would you call her, grandmama or something? He like had like a really specific name for her. And he's like, I know that you're not here anymore, but you're always here. Like, I feel you right now. And he's like, and you look very peaceful. If you wanted to know, like you look very peaceful right now. And I'm just like looking at him, I'm like, you're that connected to your grandma. You can still see her, you know, and it's so exciting. And I've seen kids like just so fascinated by a dead body, by just the vessel of it. They want to hold it. They want to like play with it. And you're just kind of like, and I see a lot of like parents freaking out, like, get off of that, like, being disrespectful. Like, why are you climbing all over, you know, grandma, or whatever it may be. And the kids are just so drawn to it. And I think I tend to kind of help the parent be a little more at ease with the understanding of like, they're not meaning to be disrespectful. They're just incredibly curious about what they're seeing. And that's going to help them really fully process and understand, so that it's not so traumatic for them later, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
That curiosity.
if you've never seen a dead body and you're like 25, imagine how like weird that's going to be for you. You're like, I've never seen a dead body. I'm 25 years old. Like, what's happening? It's going to be super freaky versus like you grew up with it. So it just seems kind of like normal.
Yeah. Yeah. I love all the work that you're doing. It's so important. And it's good to hear that it's becoming more of a kind of commonplace thing, that more people are reaching out to folks like you doing death doula work. Kind of starting to wrap up. So like, what's one resource that really like changed your life that you would recommend somebody else check out? Could be like a person, a movie, a book, like doesn't have to be related to death, just something that you found to be life-changing.
Oh man. Well, the training obviously was life-changing, Anelda, but the book is called Holding Space and is by Amy Wright Glenn. And she has something called the Birth, Breath, and Death Institute. And she is just this, how do I describe her? She's like, if you were to describe like a warm light of a human being, and almost like a beacon. So it's just like constantly calling out to death workers or people who want to be in this space. And so her book, Holding Space, changed how I practiced my work, but also kind of just gave me a different perspective on who I am as a person and how to really like see other people in the same light.
Nice. And if you could go back and give your younger self, like at 20 years old, some piece of advice, what would you tell her?
I've done this practice before, and I've actually just sat there with her and said like, man, you are so brave and you're so courageous. And I don't think you even understand how proud I am of you, because I got to become this version of myself. And we are awesome. We have everything we wanted, you know, and I've done this practice with myself before. I'm like, we have everything you ever wanted. We live in a beautiful house, in a beautiful place. We want for nothing. You have had like 3 lifetimes of like different work and jobs, and you've gone on adventures, you traveled. And I just want to tell her like, she's incredibly courageous, because half the time younger me did not know what the hell I was getting myself into or what I was doing, but I just kept moving forward and especially trying to like work through chronic depression, suicidal tendencies, you know, and the universe felt like it was against me when I was younger. And I realized like I was that dysfunctional. I was coming from a place of so much dysfunction that's what I was manifesting. you know, like, because that's where my brain was wired to like call out to. And then once I started shifting all that, everything changed. Everything was like, and now being able to really do my purpose and what I'm meant to do, I feel like this is my calling. I'm like so grateful for her. I'm like, I love you so much, younger version of me that didn't know what the hell she was doing. That was a mess, that was constantly self-doubting and insecure and didn't realize how much of a light she really was. So.
Awesome. I'm so glad that the younger you made it to be the current you, because you are amazing.
Thank you. Me too. Dang, because that girl sure did try. She's like, I need to not be here. But yeah.
If people want to connect with you, find out more about your work, how can they do that?
So I primarily live on Instagram. So I'm at Death Empath. And my website is there. But I mean, you can visit it if you like. It's a very early version of what I was originally trying to do. But Instagram for sure.
Cool. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you. This is awesome.